The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon and good morning to those of you out west. My name is Rob Shuster, and today's presentation is going to be on high-risk terminations. So let's go ahead and get started because we have a full agenda in this hour session. I want to begin with just an overview of what we're going to cover. We'll talk about, in general, the concept of workplace violence in general, besides high-risk terminations. You have to understand that the violence is a progressive thing. It's not an event. It's usually a process. And that's important. We'll note it several times in this presentation. There are also, relative to terminations that may be high risk, there are certain influences, usually in a person's life, that can increase that risk. We'll review those, as well as the different types of high-risk employees that may be terminated. Some of them are obvious. The reason for the termination is their inappropriate behavior, their aggressiveness. So those by design are high risk. Others are not so obvious. They could sneak up on you. Then we'll have the review of high risk behaviors. It's important that all of your employees, not just your supervisory staff, recognize some of these. And I'm sure you've seen these in the past, so it'll be a quick review of some of these behavioral indicators that there may be a problem brewing. And it's important that the employees know to notice them and have a requirement to report them for you to be able to get out in front of the problem. Then we'll get into the safe termination, the process itself. And I use the word process by design. It is not an event. It's not a singular interview and the person is escorted out. There's a process that goes into this if you're going to do it right. We'll go over the termination interview logistics for the day of the event and some post-termination actions that are absolute requirements if you do not want this person to come back. So that's kind of an overview of the presentation. I want to start by just stating that obviously this high-risk terminations is a subset of the larger problem of workplace violence issues, and their prevention. In terms of high-risk terminations, some of them, as I said, are very obvious. When the termination itself is a result of displayed unacceptable aggressive behavior, then it's not hard to figure out that the termination event involving that person is going to be high risk and have the possibility of there being a violent reaction. However, there are some others that are not so obvious. People who don't give the precursory indicators, but have some influencers in their lives that if you know about them, that it might indicate that a termination for this person, especially if it's one that's not for cause, that just might be something to set them off. Keeping in mind that these people don't typically just snap, that there is a progression of events, as we said before. Some of these, if you do a little research behind the people that are involved, you might find that someone is perhaps a high-risk threat for termination that you might not have otherwise expected. Clearly, your concerns for harm are with in the immediate sense for the people that are involved either in an incident that happens leading to a termination or the termination itself. At the termination session, and then later. It is a fallacy that once the termination is completed, your problem is solved. That could be the end of one problem and the start of a bigger one. Your desire is to have a longer-term impact on the employee who is departing and to take away their desire to come back for retaliation. As I said, violence is not an act or event, it's the end of a process. And that process usually has some progressively more serious and identifiable warning signs along the way. It does you no good just to train the supervisors, though, to see these warning signs because they're not following the employee. They're not working with the employee hand in hand usually every single day. However, their coworkers are. The coworker is more likely to see someone in distress, to notice changes in behavior, to experience bullying, to notice whether somebody is the victim of an abusive spouse, to find out whether there's something going on in that person's life that is changing their behavior in an aggressive manner. The employees are the ones, the coworkers, they're the ones that are going to know this, not necessarily the supervisors. In fact, this behavior might be hidden from the supervisors. So it's important to involve all the employees and that they know what to recognize. Furthermore, they get a sense that there's a responsibility to report what they recognize in a discreet manner. Many of these high-risk terminations involve employees that they've been a long-term concern. An example of this is the bully. The workplace bully typically, once the problem comes to someone's attention, you can assume that that problem's been existing for some time before. It's just gone unreported, and it's due to the intimidation factor. Bullies are effective at what they do, and because of that effectiveness, they typically can hang around longer than you would like them to. And once it comes to somebody's attention, that usually is as a result of a mounting condition that's reached a proportion that people just can't tolerate anymore. But it should have been addressed earlier. So understand that. Now, there's no high-risk profile. Obviously, profiling is not something we want to do. And when workplace violence issues were discussed maybe a decade ago, there was always this attempt to come out with a person's profile that is more likely to engage in workplace violence. There's no profile of a personality, but there are patterns of behavior which are cause for concern, and those patterns of behavior we'll review in this presentation. As I said before, the influencing behaviors, changing personal circumstances, substance abuse, spousal abuse, divorce, financial problems, problems with children. Getting help might just fix the problem, which is causing the deteriorating performance, and it might negate the necessity for the termination in the first place. So it's important to have a finger on the pulse of your workforce and your workers so that you know if there is, for example, a downsizing or a reduction in force where you're going to have some terminations that are not for cause. You might have some of those high-risk individuals because of these changing personal circumstances that are going to be involved, and you wouldn't consider them high risk. So the emotional state can definitely influence a tendency to be violent. That this is where rarely does someone just snap without some warning or without some reason of mounting influence, and that's what you want to be aware of. Let's look at the specific types of high-risk employees, and we'll start with the one that's the most prevalent and probably the most obvious, and that's the workplace bully. There are more of these folks in operations in your companies, your organizations, than you might think. They have a history of intimidation, a history of aggressive behavior. And as this comes to your attention, as I said before, this probably has gone on for some time. They have been able to avoid disciplinary actions because of that intimidation. Now, I would caution you that avoiding dealing with this, avoiding dealing with a person that's just a problem, and there's several ways that people will avoid. I'll get to that in the next slide. But any avoidance leads to tolerance. It's interpreted as tolerance, and by the person that's practicing this. And the tolerance then leads to, well, they just accept my behavior. It must be acceptable, and they will continue. There's no reason for them not to. The companies often, or supervisors often, will make rationalizations for certain people. Quotes like, "We really didn't think that he was serious about the comments that he made," or "We just can't lose them. Let's try to work around this because this is a vital person to our operation." You have got to have a no tolerance policy when it comes to this. because they will cost you more than they're worth, no matter how valuable an employee they are. The longer you wait, trust me, the worse it will get, because that tolerance will lead to acceptance, and it's almost as if you're rewarding the behavior by accepting it. Employees, as you know, in HR, and I would imagine some of you are in HR and some of you are in security. In HR, you always know that employees who are going to be terminated should generally not be surprised by it if it's for cause, because there should have been progressive discipline leading up to this termination. Rifts and downsizings, that's maybe a little different, but there shouldn't be a surprise element in this. Managers and some of the ways that these bullies avoid being terminated or having it allow is that managers, because of the intimidation and their fear, they give good ratings to poor performers. They give good ratings just so they're not a victim of the bullying. Furthermore, and even worse, they might transfer them to another department. Well, old Joe didn't work out well in our department, but I'm sure he'll be fine in yours. Or worse yet, they promote them out. So as ironic as this sounds, the bully can be quite effective just simply because of that intimidation factor. And you have to have supervisory people that are assertive enough to stop this with your disciplinary process. Let's look at another type, the disgruntled employee. This is the employee that believes that they've been treated unfairly. And they can be very overly focused on a single traumatic event, whether it's a promotion that they didn't get, they felt they were passed over, whether it's a particular pay raise they didn't get, something that they believe they've been slighted on. And they become fixated on it. They become increasingly withdrawn and self-absorbed, very negative about everything. These people can be almost cancerous in your workforce. They believe that the system, the organization, just cannot solve their problems. And here's where the danger comes in. They have decided, they won't announce this, but in their own minds, they'll decide that there will come a time when they may have to take things into their own hands. And that's when they become dangerous. So you may have some of them that might get caught in a riff or a downsizing, and this can sneak up on you. Another that can really sneak up on you is the overly attached employee. This is the person whose life is their job. They literally cannot leave. They're the first in the office in the morning and the last out at night. They are deeply dependent on the company for a variety of their critical personal needs. Work is their family, and they sometimes don't have a support structure at home. This is the work people. Those are the only friends they have. They identify with their job, and work is their whole life. So if these folks are caught in a riff or a downsizing, you can see where they would feel absolutely betrayed and rejected if they're terminated, especially if it's not done for cause. If they're just an innocent victim of a necessary business decision, as unpleasant as it is, they can't process it that way. They feel like they're victimized. And sometimes they feel like they have no options. And the violence that they may display would be truly out of character, but it's almost as if they uncontrollably act out. These are really the type that will sneak up on you, because these people, it's an absolute feeling of despair. That job is all they had, and when it comes to a close, it's as if their life is ending. And you can imagine their despair, and their likely response might be aggressive. And then finally, the category that is another one that might sneak up on you. This is the one there, the person is I call it the end of their rope. There has been a culmination of bad events in their life in a short period of time, a family loss, divorce, bankruptcy, any of those that I named earlier, and it's a cumulative effect. It's not just one thing, but it's a series of things. Now, often they'll cause emotional distress, and if they don't have an effective support system at home, then you're going to see a deterioration of the performance. And that might lead then to evaluation as to whether termination is necessary. This is characterized by them feeling absolutely hopeless. There's just no way out. And they may have even made comments about suicide. Things are getting so bad. Now, can you see now where it's important for the employees to not only recognize these signs, but know that it's their responsibility for the betterment of all of them, the safety of the entire workforce, to share this information in a discreet manner, because the supervisor might not see this every day. But if the coworkers see it every day, this could be a very serious problem that's brewing, and somebody needs to know about it. And then if there's a termination that's required, again, in a one that's unexpected, whether it's for cause because of the deteriorating performance, or whether it's without cause, the termination itself is perceived as just the last straw. It is the last thing that this person can endure, and they just can't take it anymore. And if you're going to categorize somebody as someone that snapped, this is the person that they've just hit the end of their rope, and that's it. So those are the different types of high risk terminations that you could become involved in. As you see, some of them it's going to be obvious you'll need to prepare, and others you're going to have to do a little homework to evaluate what individuals are involved and could any of them be high risk. So I said we would review some of the behaviors. I've talked about getting the employees involved in observing and reporting these problem behaviors. So let's review them. It's a list that you have probably seen before several times, but let's review them. Certainly any overt or direct threats are cause for alarm and cause for investigation. Threats can be also implied or conditional or direct or indirect, and they're much more subtle, but they're every bit as effective in terms of creating fear and intimidation in the eyes of the victim, your employees. Statements like that end in or else, or if you know what's good for you, things like this. Those are bullying tactics. Those are threatening conditional threats, and that kind of communication can't be tolerated. It's got to be addressed. Signs of emotional distress often include decreased productivity. That kind of is a natural occurrence. A change in social interaction. Someone who would ordinarily be and has ordinarily been an engaging person, a social person, now all of a sudden they're withdrawn. They always seem to be in a bad mood or depressed, sullen. And when somebody tries to talk to them about what might be bothering them, they get very defensive, if not aggressive. So the changes in social interaction or lack thereof. A deterioration in self-care and hygiene. Someone who usually looked pretty squared away, well-dressed, clean, neat, not so much anymore. And all of this cumulatively, none of these behavior indicators, I should state this, by itself, other than maybe the direct threat overtly, none of these indicators we'll talk about are a problem singularly. You might say, well, geez, half of my staff displays these at some point in time. It's the cumulative effect of several of them at one time, or increasingly being displayed. Explosive outbursts. Somebody reacts disproportionately to a condition that they're faced with, and it just seems really strange that they totally overreact to something. There is obviously a history, and a history of aggressive behavior is an indicator. Now, I want you to take a look at the photograph that you see on the right side of the screen. Two individuals, obviously one gentleman yelling, appearing to be yelling and berating the other gentleman sitting down. Now, I ask you this. Clearly in this photograph, we're depicting the guy that's standing on the left to be the aggressor, the bully, demeaning and yelling and clearly being inappropriate in a workspace towards this other gentleman. However, here's my question to you. How long do you think that person on the left, or I'm sorry, on the right that's seated, how long do you think that man's going to tolerate this behavior? Day in, day out, or week in, week out, he's berated and continually treated like this. How long do you think it will be before that person, just one day, can't take it anymore and at least acts out somewhat aggressively with a push or a shove, clearly that physical contact like that is unacceptable behavior. So now you're going to be disciplining and perhaps terminating both employees, and I don't think that's fair. That's not right. That's our fault for not seeing this problem brewing and taking care of it, taking care of the aggressive behavior on the part of the one person before it becomes something that victimizes two people. So just give that some thought. Any affirmation of other violence events as solutions. Somebody's, a lot of this is water cooler talk, but somebody sees something on television about a workplace violence incident, and we're seeing those with disturbing frequency now, and they make a comment that's totally off color and out of character. They say, well, boy, that guy knew how to take care of business, or something positively affirming that kind of activity. That should be a behavioral warning sign. A total fixation on weapons. Now, that doesn't mean gun collectors and people that shoot for sport, etc., because a lot of people own guns and shoot them for sport. I mean a total fixation on weapons in conjunction with a lot of these other behavior patterns. Social isolation, poor peer relations, the chronic feeling of complaining, a feeling of injustice, negative all the time, maybe even verbalized self-destructive notions. Substance abuse is another behavior indicator. I guarantee you, if this is a problem that this person is having with substance abuse, even though you'd like to say, well, as long as they keep it out of the workplace and it's just a personal problem at home, what can we do about it? It is going to manifest itself in the workplace, I guarantee you. So you cannot turn a blind eye to it. Developing inattention to rules and resistance. Someone who ordinarily was, a pretty rule-abiding employee is no more. And they're starting to act out. They're starting to fly in the face of regulations or procedures out of character. Some reality distortion, paranoia, that whole they're out to get me mentality. Also poor impulse control. It's that emotional outburst at what you might consider something that's fairly slight. Personal space boundary violations, that is a real tool of the bully. When they're literally getting in people's faces, they invade their personal space, and you all know what that is. It's about 3 feet in front of you for someone that you really don't know well or aren't intimate with. When they start getting closer than that, that violates your personal space. Well, bullies will use that as a tactic all the time. It's subtle, but it's very aggressive, and it can be intimidating. But the last one I want you to focus on, and the biggest indicator is whether it's a conglomeration of several of these bullet points that we've gone over here or whatever, your coworkers are afraid. If you have coworkers that are literally afraid of someone in the workplace, and it could be a supervisor, not just for their being in fear of their jobs because of their position, but the tactics, the bullying tactics. If you have that fear factor, you have a problem. So now, those are the types of high-risk termination types of employees you might want to be concerned about, the obvious and the not obvious. We've gone over some emotional influencers and the behavior indicators that all of your employees should be alert for. Now let's talk about the termination process itself. And I call it a process because there are several steps that you need to complete and complete effectively before you decide on the termination and plan for the termination interview. Your objective is to stabilize the current situation, whether this is a sudden event, a fight, or something that has happened suddenly, it's totally unacceptable, aggressive behavior, or whether this is a situation that it's been developmental, as in the bullying. Your priorities are to address the immediate security concerns, obviously, because it's the safety and welfare of everybody in the employee that's your responsibility. And that might cause you to, jumping down to the last bullet, that might cause you to need to temporarily exit the employee from the workplace. I'll come back to that, but in order to meet the immediate security concerns, you may have to send both people home immediately. That will give you time to conduct a preliminary risk and incident assessment. Okay, what happened here? What led to what? Is there been a history of this? What actually went down? And it allows you to control your risks, to keep everyone safe, but give yourself time to decide. Now let's talk a little bit more about this exiting of the employee prior to any decision to terminate, just to get that control. It does a number of things. As I said, it ensures the safety and establishes security for the immediate moment and safeguards the workplace. It gives your employees, those that are involved, whether it's one or more, time to diffuse, time to cool down, out of the work environment. They need to just chill and go home and evaluate what happened and what their reaction was and what their behavior was like. It gives them time to calm down. It tests your ability or the employee's ability to comply with those and control those impulses. It allows you time to better obtain an assessment, an investigation of what it is that happened. You might find that your initial reaction, let's say it was a fight or a pushing shoving match, your immediate response is, well, they both need to be terminated. But upon investigation, you might find, well, termination might not be necessary. There might be alternatives. There might have been reasons for this. There might be disciplinary alternatives to consider. And if termination is necessary, then you can talk about the logistics of the event and other conditions that are going to surround that termination interview. So it's important for you to investigate thoroughly before you jump to all too often it's the mentality, and it's a very common mistake, along with denial and avoidance in acting too hastily. Companies will turn a blind eye and deny they have a problem, or once they recognize the problem, they'll just say, well, let's just get rid of him. That solves our problem. Remember, just getting rid of him might not be the end of your problem, might be the end of your current problem, but it might be the beginning of a bigger one when they're so fixated on coming back to the workplace that displaced them and acting out violently. During this investigation, you may uncover some history, a cover-up. Cover-ups are important because those that swept this under the rug for so long, they need to be addressed. That practice needs to cease, because you may have other problem children out there that aren't being adequately addressed or disciplined for the chance of correcting their behavior. And if it's not a supervisory tactic that is being preached, then it won't be practiced. Many of your opinions, or your options, I should say, they end when the employee leaves. If they're still in your employee, if they're a marginal employee, what they did was marginal, the activity wasn't so egregious that it calls for immediate termination, you may be able to help them. But your options are very limited once they leave your employ. Now, the other thing it does is allow you, if a determination is made that the termination is necessary, you can then investigate if there's been any arrests recently, if there's been any weapons purchased, if there's been any restraining orders that have been issued. Find out a little bit more about this person before you have the termination interview. So who does all this investigation? That's where it's important to have a case assessment team. The assessment team, and they may delegate certain of their tasks to individuals, but the team collectively, they review the circumstances and they collect the further historical data to find out what happened, and has there been any history to indicate that this is an ongoing problem. They can seek others co-workers that engage with this individual on a more regular basis. Maybe things have been held back because the people weren't encouraged to report the behavior indicators, and all of a sudden when the investigation is launched, you see a lot of people stepping forward to say what they've seen. You also can identify some critical resources. If the determination is made that you do need to terminate, you might need the assistance of some third-party assistance, whether that is additional security, whether that is perhaps a psychological evaluation by a clinical professional to help you in this case and give you some guidance. There are third-party professionals available to help you. This investigation allows you to not to minimize the problem, but also not to exaggerate it as more things come to light. Don't shortcut this just to get to a termination, because You might find the termination isn't necessary, or if it is necessary, you might find that you have to take it far more seriously and qualify it as a high risk one when you otherwise might not have. So in terms of planning for the termination interview itself, your whole risk reduction strategy should circle around doing it in a manner that makes this person not want to come back and act out violently. Jumping down to that last bullet, you want to take away their desire to return violently. I've spoken to many of the clinical psychologists that we work with, and they'll say repeatedly that the people after the fact that they talk to, after the termination, as they're trying to get their lives back in order, they'll say, well, I just wanted to be listened to. I just needed to be understood. I wanted to be treated fairly. And if they felt they were, there is far less of a chance of them fixating on that company and wanting to come back to act out violently because of being terminated. Now, in this, that's the large picture strategy. Tactically, you need to think through the entire day of the event. Attention to the details, and we'll go over the details in the next series of slides about where you do it, when you do it, room setup, things like that. Excuse me. You want to be prepared for all foreseeable outcomes and consequences. Perhaps this termination will go very smoothly. The person will hopefully come to the realization that this was necessary. They've gone through the progressive disciplinary process. Their behavior didn't change. They saw this coming and they halfway expected it. And they accept it. Or they might really act out quite violently in the meeting, in the interview, or just after the interview. You want to identify the resources that might be available and necessary. If you need additional security to assist you with the process and be in a standby mode for the event. You might need that clinical psychologist to help you through the process. You might need outplacement assistance. A lot of times outplacement assistance is used as that third party communicator after the fact. We'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute. But remember, you want to take away their desire to return by doing the termination, if it's necessary, in a discreet and somewhat personal or humane manner. Logistically, I'm often asked, well, what day of the week? What time of the day? Where should this be done? Should this be done in an office that is common? Should it be done in a conference room? Should it be done in the HR office? All too often, the decision is out of convenience. The HR people who are obviously involved in these, they want to do them in their own office because they're comfortable in their own environment and they feel that that's when they can be most effective. But you need to think about what has made this high risk and what are the worst case scenario conditions that might result as a result of this interview. I would suggest to you exterior office areas that are closer to stairwells or elevators or closer to exits. What you don't want to have is somebody leaving the office in which the termination interview was conducted and having to walk through the whole workforce to get out of the office area. You don't want that. Being a former policeman, I call it the perp walk. You want to avoid that because that can be very demeaning and embarrassing. So find a way and think through, once the interview is over, how are you going to exit the employee in the most discreet and quick manner? What day of the week? Well, there are arguments both ways. Mondays are just horrible days. You don't want to do it on Monday. You don't have a day to plan for it. So avoid Monday, Tuesdays. Wednesday, midweek. If you have someone that, if they're terminated, if you think the first thing they're going to want to do is jump on board the next day and start looking for another job to get on with things, then perhaps a midweek day selection would give them that opportunity to turn a very negative thing into a positive thing the next day, looking for new work. And they don't want to waste time doing it. If you did that for that kind of person, if you did it on a Friday, then they'd have to wait the whole weekend and brew on it until they could do something assertively on Monday, absent the online options they have. But so that's one argument. A Friday, also, there's a pro and con in this. It gives them time to cool off. If you did it on a Wednesday and it was a person that was used to, getting up every day and going to work, and the fact that they're not going to get up that Thursday morning and go to work is going to be devastating to them, then that might not be a good thing. A Friday might be better because they're not getting up Saturday to come into work anyway. A Friday might give them the weekend to calm down, cool off, reassess, and start doing something productive on Monday. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no best day. I'd avoid early in the week because you don't have the planning time then. But evaluate the person that you're dealing with and find out what would be best. Figure out what you think would be best for them in terms of day of the week. And then it's time of day. And I will tell you that you pick the time of day where there's the fewest people around. It's just that simple. You minimize those that are exposed to the danger. Typically, the end of the day, as people are leaving anyway, might be a little better choice. In terms of preparing the room, and I have some visuals in the next several slides that I'll go over in terms of preparing the room for the actual interview. But so let's save that for the next slides. Again, your exit access is important because once this termination interview is completed, you want that person to be exiting the building as quickly and as discreetly as you can have them do so. You would like to have, as the interview is being conducted, there should be other staff that can gather their belongings, can get the necessary keys, purses, things that they're going to need that very minute when they exit to get home. Box their personal items up and ship it to them the next day. You don't want to have them go through and go back to the office and box their stuff and then have to walk past all the employees with their box of stuff. That can be demeaning. It's best to just exit them, have their keys, whatever they need to go home with, ready for them as they exit that room. And then their stuff, you can tell them it's being shipped to them the next day. I'm asked frequently if considering an off-site location is a good idea. In other words, instead of endangering the people in your workforce, well, why don't we just do this exit interview at a hotel or at a restaurant nearby, a neutral area? It might reduce the chances that this person would act out. I would offer this opinion. It's probably not going to reduce the chances that they're going to act out because the emotional things that drive them to act out in the first place aren't really controlled at all by their environment. They might find that not being around their coworkers gives them an even more open door to act out. But more importantly, if I'm the owner of that hotel or that restaurant, that you've brought your high-risk employee to my establishment to terminate them, I'm going to have some serious legal, and something happens, this person acts out, and there's a fight or something more serious, and violence occurs in my facility, then I'm going to have my attorneys asking questions like, now wait a minute, excuse me, you felt that you were going to terminate your employee, you felt they were so dangerous, you didn't want to do it in your own building, so you brought them to my hotel or to my restaurant to do it? I think you have a pretty strong case there. So I don't think that is a good idea. You can't control the environment as much. And if they act out, you're going to have legal ramifications involving that property owner, not just your own facility. So though these have been done before offsite, I don't suggest it. You want it on your own home court. You want it so that you can control the environment, and any ramifications are just on you and won't involve another party, another business. In the age of telecommuting, I know that some of these it might be necessary to do these terminations via telephone. If that's necessary, so be it, but it's preferable not to do it by phone. It's preferable to do it in person if at all possible. Let's think logistically about the room setup. But I'll mention 4 different things I want you to keep in mind when you're talking about the physical room setup. Number 1 is to provide a space buffer between, whether that's with an item of furniture or just space, some type of a buffer between the interviewer and the person being terminated. Whether it's a one-on-one situation or whether there's going to be somebody else in the room to assist. And I would suggest that. There's always should be at least 2 people in the room. You want to keep in mind, 1, the concept of a space buffer. Number 2, you want to keep in mind the concept of an unobstructed exit, so that the person who's doing the interviewing, if the terminated employee starts to act out, they can get out. They're not trapped. The third concept is that they should not be allowed in the room with anything, any packages, any purses, any briefcases that they could have a weapon in. So no bags come into the room with them. And you should sterilize the room in a way that, removing items like staplers, computers, telephones, things that could be picked up and used as a weapon in the heat of the moment, in an irrational moment. Just take those away from that environment. It should be a fairly sterile environment. And the last concept is to be able, if you don't have someone in the room with you assisting in the interview, then be able to summon someone quickly that is in standby mode, either in the next room or out in the hallway. So those are the 4 concepts when you're setting up physically the room that I want you to keep in mind. In this first graphic, you can see that this is a typical, office setting. The doors at the number 1 is the interviewer. That would be the person delivering the message, and the subject is number 2. That's the person being terminated. Well, number 1 person here is trapped by the desk. If number 2 starts to act out, they will absolutely move around that desk in between the door and that person, and you don't have an escape. So that's not a scenario I would want. I would prefer this type of a setting where you have both people, and that buffer there, that could either be a physical table or just space where the interviewer has the ability to escape if things go bad, and they're not trapped in there. Often a conference room is used. This would be a situation where if the interviewer is in either one of the number 1 positions, and the interviewee, the person being terminated, is sitting where the number 2 dot is, you can see the same concept. They're trapped. So we want to avoid that. And you also might want to, you now have chairs around this person, more than 1 chair that can be used as a weapon. So remember those 4 concepts: the space buffer, the unobstructed exit, no items for weapons, and being able to summon help quickly. In the conference room scenario, I would prefer this type of a setup where you have the interviewer and the interviewee sitting, both of them right by the door, neither one of them feeling trapped, and that might ease the tension a bit in the room. So on this, in terms of exiting the employee, it should be discreet but complete. If security is available, and it should be, there's often a debate about, well, should it be armed security? Should it be uniformed security? That depends on the person, how they respond to figures of authority. If a uniform is going to be one that's going to irritate them and set them off, then perhaps maybe a plainclothes person not in the room with them. You can have 2 HR people in the room doing the interview, and a security person perhaps in the room just outside in the hallway listening, or in the room next door. If you felt that a visible sign of authority would keep them under control, then it might be considered. Armed, whenever somebody asks me, well, should we work this in an armed capacity? My answer is, well, no, because you should plan the event in a way that the firearm does not become required. That's why you're not letting them carry items into the interview room. That's why you're escorting them completely out of the facility so they can't get to a weapon. I don't think armed is a requirement for this. I would prefer to have, if you think they're going to be that boisterous and react that violently, I'd prefer to have 2 security people who are able to physically restrain them without the use of a firearm, without shooting them. There should be no goodbye sessions on the way out. No, you want to have those, again, I mentioned this before, ship the personal belongings to them immediately. Make sure you have their keys or whatever they're going to need to exit quickly and immediately. But you don't want them going back to clean out their desk, to say goodbye to everybody. They can do that on the phone later, because this is just going to prolong an embarrassing process for them, and it may not be to their advantage or yours. You also have a duty to warn once the interview has been completed and the person has been exited from the building. You need to notify the workforce that this person is terminated and they should not be allowed back in the building. So it's important for you to notify your workforce, and it's particularly your security force, who may not know that this, if your entire uniformed guard forces is out there and they don't know that this person's been terminated. Obviously you're going to collect their badges, etc. But if this person is just facially recognized, the security officer might let them in the next day, not knowing they'd been terminated. So you really have a duty to warn about this person being terminated to both your security and the other employees, who should also know not to just let them in the next day. You need to stick to the boundaries set in the termination interview, whether it's regarding severance. Now, a lot of times there's a debate about whether we should pay severance or not. I look at severance as a pretty cheap insurance policy. You can make severance conditions that keep them away from the property, or the severance will be relinquished and not paid. That's something for them to lose. Severance is kind of a cheap insurance policy. And any further contact with the organization should be through that third party that you've arranged, whether it's the clinical psychologist, whether it's the outplacement person, whether it's a contracted security consultant, whatever that is. The contact between that terminated employee and the organization should be via a third party. In your post-termination actions, there's a number of things to consider. Outplacement doesn't mean you're recommending this person for another job. I mean, you have terminated them for inappropriate behavior, so it'd be hard for you to recommend them. But it doesn't mean you can't give them assistance in helping them through the process of finding another job. That's simply what outplacement is. That can both be your person, that can be a conduit of information for you, the organization, as well as a great help to that person who maybe they have been a long-term employee and haven't looked for a job in 20 years and don't know how to do it effectively. So consider outplacement assistance, counseling for whatever emotional or personal issues they had that led to your having to terminate them, and then the community support services that are available. Don't overlook these. Keep in mind, too, that part of the case assessment process, in your EAPs, you might find that getting this person help, getting them some guidance, some counseling, it might change their behavior patterns and the requirement for the termination in the first place. So keep that in mind as well as you go through your case assessment process and your progressive discipline. You could also consider a separate exit interview by a threat assessment professional if there are still concerns by the way they left and their actions, whatever they communicated upon their termination interview. You might need a continuing threat assessment by a third-party professional. The other thing that has been asked of me frequently is the wisdom of surveillance afterwards. And this is a double-edged sword. To be quite honest with you, as a former policeman and having done surveillance and executive protection in a number of different capacities, surveillance is not like it works on TV. It is hard to do surveillance in a manner that you are not detected. Most companies that The rationale behind considering surveillance of the person that's been terminated is that, well, if the guy's going to leave, go to the bar, get drunk, go to his house and his garage and get his rifle and get back in the car and head back to the office, we might like to have a heads up on that. That extreme of a case, yes, it would be good to have surveillance to give you an early warning that that activity is happening. More frequently, though, you might be dealing with somebody that after their termination, they have a real sense of despair and maybe even that paranoia. And if they're followed and they see you, that is going to make them more inclined to want to act out. That is going to make them more angry at the situation. And it may be counterproductive. And it is difficult. Most companies would only pay for a one investigator and one car type of surveillance. Well, that's hard to do professionally and not be spotted, I guarantee you. Unless you're using multiple cars and multiple agents, it is hard to surveil somebody over a length of time and not be spotted. So that is a risk that you run. The other risk is if you've decided that the circumstances are bad enough that it requires surveilling this terminated person for some time afterwards, then there's got to be some criteria for the decision to terminate that surveillance. Well, how long do you do this? This can be an expensive proposition. How long are you going to follow this person? How long are you going to keep tabs on them? And when you decide, okay, that's enough, is it 3 days? Is it 1 day? Is it 3 weeks? Is it a month? We got to cut the expenses sometime. What criteria are you going to use in terms of changed behavior that tells you, okay, the surveillance which we thought was necessary is no longer so? Because what if something happens after that? These people have been known in some of the more cases of violence, they come back 6 months, 2 years, 9 years later. You can't surveil them that whole time. So if you had surveillance, you take it off and something then happens a week later, there may be some legal ramifications to that. So I will tell you, if you want to do surveillance, if the indicators and your consultants tell you it might be a good idea to keep tabs on this person, and don't overlook social media surveillance either. They'll talk a lot more on social media about what they have planned than their activity could indicate. If you decide to do that, just do it professionally. Do it adequately and make sure professionals are doing it so they aren't caught. That could lead to a very counterproductive situation. So, in terms of ongoing actions after the termination is completed, you can make this a requirement of their package that clearly they stay off property, they don't return, that you can make it a condition that they meet with your third-party assistant who's helping them find other work, helping with the outplacement situation, but also just listening to them and helping to get them through this process. That's been very valuable with some of the clinical people that I've talked to. They find having a voice, someone to just hear them out, to hear their side of the story, to help them through this difficult process and help them get on with their lives. The vicarious benefit is you now have someone who's maintaining a communication channel without exposure to your company that you can keep tabs on how this person's doing. Are they moving on with their life? Are they able to move on and not be fixated on your company, especially at critical junctures like anniversary dates of hire or anniversary dates of when they're terminated, or birthdays or other significant dates, which is where some people could act out. I want you to remember that what will most likely lead to your long-term safety after the employee leaves is if they leave feeling that they were heard and were treated respectfully. And if you can accomplish that in a high-threat termination or a high-risk termination, then that's the most that you can do. So in summary, we have about 5 minutes or 6 minutes left for questions, but in summary, I want you as an organization to get out of denial. Don't just say that, well, we don't have any problems in our workforce. We don't have to worry about workplace violence prevention. We don't have any problems. You may have some problems that are under the surface, and unless you're involving all your employees in that problem behavior recognition, you may have a problem and don't even know you have it. Conversely, don't act too hastily. Don't just jump to a conclusion because of one event that the person just has to be terminated, and that'll be the end of your problem. Make sure you provide assertive supervisory action, and that your risk reduction is based on good case management. Think thoroughly through that termination process if it's necessary, and most of all, think long-term by being fair, respectful, and creative. Now, I will mention to you, we've gone through a lot of information very quickly. I'm going to open it up for questions now, but if you send me an email from your business email account, you request these slides, I will send them to you. Just send me an email, and if you'd like some comments on the session, that would be great. But I will send you these slides that you would be free to use within your own organizations. So at this point, I thank you for your attention and open it up to questions. If you want to use your chat box. Okay, the first question I got was the person had to leave early, but the question was, will we share the slides? And I just answered that. Yes, we will. Are there any other questions? We'll give it a couple of minutes. I don't see any other questions coming in. I also see people dropping off, so I think that will be enough for the session. I appreciate your attention and joining us today. You have my contact information on the slide there. If you have any further questions, would like to talk about something one-on-one, just give me a call and we'll chat. Have a nice afternoon or morning, and thank you for attending.